One more. Okay, it's the modal argument from evil. And it's okay. So it's slightly cheating because it's a version of the problem of evil, but it has like distinctive aspects that I think are cool and fun. And this is ultimately just to get people aware that there are more arguments on the problem of evil. So, the modal argument from evil, I'll present a version of it here. It's a similar argument. Roughly the same argument is developed and extensively defended in philosopher Karl Brownson's dissertation. His dissertation is freely available online. It's entitled Evil and Ontological Disproof. So, I mean, the rough rendition is like, hey, premise one, it's possible for there to be a world exclusively populated with vast amounts of gratuitous evil and no goods accruing therefrom. Premise two, if such a world is possible, then it's possible that God doesn't exist. Premise three, if it's possible that God doesn't exist, then God doesn't exist. And conclusion, God doesn't exist. So it's very similar to the modal ontological argument for theism. The modal ontological argument for theism says that, hey, it's at least possible for God to exist. And since God's a necessary being, God's either going to have to exist in all worlds or exist in none of them, right? So if it's possible that he exists, if he exists in one possible world, then he must exist in all of them. Well, this argument is basically turning that on its head. And it's saying, well, hey, it's at least possible for there to be a world in which God doesn't exist. And again, like God would plausibly be a necessary being if God exists at all. So then God's either going to have to span all possible worlds or no possible worlds. And since he doesn't span all possible worlds, right, he fails to exist in at least one possible world, it follows that God exists in no possible worlds. So in particular, God doesn't exist in the actual world. And why think that there's a possible world in which God doesn't exist? Well, this is where we try to give some independent reason to think that. And it's from the possibility of there being a world which is so overwhelmingly bad that God just would never actualize that sort of world. Either it would be impermissible for God to actualize it, or if you don't like imputing the categories of permissibility and impermissibility onto God, then it just would be of such a terrible character, the world that is, that given God's character, he just would never actualize it. It would be inconsistent with his goodness to kind of create a world like that. So that's how one is trying to motivate the possible non-existence of God. It's from the possibility that there's a world that is so overwhelmingly bad that God would never actualize it. And that world, which is so overwhelmingly bad, is, something like, we could describe it in various ways, but it's like a world exclusively populated with like vast amounts of gratuitous evil and no goods accruing therefrom. Now the question then is, why think that that's a possible world? Well, there are some independent reasons to think that's at least a possible world, and these derive from various modal principles or modal tools that philosophers use to infer what's possible. So, one such principle is conceivability or imaginability. Very often we take something to be possible because it seems totally conceivable. I mean, even earlier on in the conversation, right? I was like, well, I think I can conceive of someone who knows that something is wrong and they believe that it's wrong, but nevertheless they're not motivated to act in accordance with it because they just don't care about morality. I was trying to argue, like, that seems at least conceivable, so it seems at least possible that someone could do that. So, like, we very often just intuitively shift from something's being conceivable to something's being possible, and arguably conceivability or imaginability provides evidence for something's being possible. And one might think that, like this world, which is, populated with vast amounts of gratuitous evils and no goods accruing therefrom, like I can describe it in such a way that it really does seem imaginable. I mean, imagine that it's basically just like the world is just a billion-year long, just animals experiencing sort of factory farming conditions or something like that, and somehow they're like kept alive or something like that through like some sort of miraculous technology or whatever. We can specify it in various ways, or like new ones come into existence as the years progress, and that's basically just all that it is in the world. It's just these animals that are experiencing excruciating agony for all of time. That seems entirely conceivable, and again, we could specify the world in such a way that, like, it's not as though the animals later on in life or, later on in time are going to be getting goods accruing from the evil or whatever. So that's one sort of motivation for thinking that this is a possible world, is conceivability. Another one, I mean, there are various different motivations, but another one, then I'll just turn it over to you, is a kind of recombination principle. And these principles go back to David Lewis, and in fact, they arguably go back to David Hume, who said that there are no necessary connections between distinct existences. And what he's getting at there is that, like, if things are kind of like spatio-temporally separated, like this water bottle in the Andromeda galaxy, well, then you can have one without the other, you can have the other without the one, you can kind of recombine them and rearrange them in various ways. It's possible that things are rearranged in various ways, and it's possible that, let's say there's just a world with only a donkey. Or it's possible that there's a world with a donkey next to Donald Trump or something like that, because these things are individually possible, and we can rearrange them in various ways to form other possible worlds. And we can infer that those worlds are indeed possible, so long as the various things in that arrangement are themselves individually possible. This is a very well-motivated principle, surprisingly, in philosophy. There are, of course, objections to it, but there are also lots of motivations for it. If people want to look at philosophers who defend it, they can check out, for instance, Aaron Siegel. He defends recombination principles. But long story short is that, like, an individual space-time region containing a creature experiencing, like, excruciating agony, just contained within that region, only the excruciating agony, that's possible. And we can rearrange this region and regions like it such that it's only those regions which populate a world. And so the only thing populating the world is just this vast amount of suffering with no goods accruing therefrom. That's how we are patching together or recombining the individually possible regions. And so then by the Patrick principle or by the recombination principle, we can infer that this is a possible world. And then we get the premise. So anyway, there are more motivations besides for the premise. And this is a very controversial argument, but it's interesting. And I want to at least make people aware of these different sorts of ways that people have argued for atheism.
I really like it, man. I think that's quite fascinating. I mean, it certainly seems possible to me that, like, you know, the world of maximal evil possibly exists. That seems like, yeah, sure, totally.
And it seems intuitive as well. Like, there's nothing inconsistent about that. Like,
there's no logical impossibility. Like, it's logically possible that like,
yeah,
there's just a bunch of suffering, and the question is, would the God presiding over that, would God be able to preside over that? And I mean, I know that there's got to be. It seems like there's got to be something wrong with it. Not least that there's probably a sort of reverse version that could be put forward of, like, the possibly best world of all, which would probably contain a god. Maybe if you think that the best world contains a god. So if God possibly exists, like, I know there's probably a reverse that you could construct, but, like, it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Like, could God possibly preside over just the maximal conceivable agony? In a way, if we're going to just very easily say that it's possible this world exists because, well, it's logically possible, then we could also just as easily say, well, yeah, sure, it's logically possible that God could allow a bunch of suffering. You know, it seems very unlikely, it seems very strange, but it doesn't seem like logically impossible that he would just create a bunch of evil and suffering. I don't know, like, maybe it is. It's just kind of hard to say. I do definitely find this really interesting. And of course it relies on this modal logic move. You know, if it's possibly necessarily the case, then it is necessarily the case, which is, you know, not everybody accepts that. So I don't know, man. Like, I think that's really interesting how powerful it is. I'm definitely going to, like, bring it up with friends and use it, but more because it's kind of a headache to work out. I feel like if you were, like, really smart and thought about it for a long time, you could definitely come up with some pretty good reasons why it's not a knockdown argument. But, like, in the way it initially sort of strikes me, I'm like, yeah, man, that's got something to it. I think that's pretty cool. It's pretty powerful.
I think it's a very interesting argument, and it's not, like, immediately obvious, like, where exactly it goes wrong. And you might find theists objecting to different premises, so it's not exactly like a clearly mistaken argument. And like I said, I mean, there is independent motivation for each of the premises, it seems, like motivation that is independent of a prior rejection of God's existence. So I'm inclined to I mean, again, because we're nearing the end, we're not going to be able to go through a bunch of different objections, and, you know, the objections concerning the recombination principle and so on, but, you know, I just want to put it out there for the audience to think about it. And just in terms of ranking, I mean, I don't know where you fall, but I'd be inclined to rank it, like, reasonably highly. I mean, certainly not as, like, the standard problems of evil and so on, and maybe not hiddenness level, but maybe I'd probably put it B, honestly.
That would put it at the level of religious confusion, which I think,
yeah,
especially given that this is, like, an argument against, like, just God. It doesn't sort of rely on different religious traditions, and it does, again, rely on this, like, moral element of God not being able to reside over evil, but it seems much more to, like, attack the root. Like, this is God's existence. It's not some, like, sociological analysis. I think it's got to be at least as powerful as that. So I think B tier is not a bad shout. I think it's probably better than the evil God challenge.
Yeah, I think so.
And you're right that it's probably not as good as divine hiddenness. It might actually function better like as a syllogism, as an argument. It might sort of maybe, but like in terms of its persuasive power and cultural relevance and history, it's definitely nowhere near. So I think B tier sounds pretty fair.
All right. Well, it looks like we probably have our tier list complete.
Cool. So what did you call this one? The modal argument from evil?
Yeah, the modal argument from evil.
Modal argument from evil. It's an interesting name for it. I wonder if that's is that your label for it, or is that just what it's known as?
So I mean, Carl Brownson calls it the ontological disproof. I think that sounds horrid. That sounds horrible.
I think maybe like the modal argument from possible evil is fairer, because like the modal argument from evil seems to imply that this evil like kind of does exist. Like we've got this thing called evil that we're arguing from. It seems like it's the possibility.
Well, that's what the modal is coming in
I guess
for.
that's what the modal thing does, or like the argument from modal evil then, maybe.
Oh yeah, the argument from possible evil. Yeah.
Whatever the case, we'll just call it the modal argument from evil for simplicity's sake for the tier list. But yeah, you're right, that's complete. So, right, S tier, problem of evil. A tier, divine hiddenness. B tier, religious confusion and the modal argument from evil, or the argument from modal evil, or the modal argument from modal possible evil that's possibly modal. C tier, the evil god challenge, sitting alone. D tier is our most populous category, with universe big, therefore no god, the improvability argument, and the argument from material causality, although controversially, because Joe thinks it should be higher. In E tier, we have the god rock, which is sunk on our tier list down to the bottom, and may, on further reflection, sink further down to the F tier, given that it does just seem to exist in a different category to these kinds of arguments. Having said that, I just think it's not like, I mean, trivially, we could come up with something like, you know, my dog bit me today, therefore God doesn't exist, which would probably go in the F tier. And so I think we sort of need to almost ceremonially leave the F tier completely blank as a reminder that, like, there are literally as many arguments for and against the existence of God as you can possibly imagine if you're allowing them to be bad ones. So I'm kind of happy with leaving the F tier blank. And you know what? I think this is a relatively healthy looking tier list. But like I say, I'll be interested to see what other people think. So like, unless you have any particular last minute changes you want to make to it, I think I'm happy to sort of wrap it up there.
Same here. I think it's great.